privacy, they spend their time loudly playing drums, setting off fireworks, and playing polo in their front yard. When Kyle is angered by how their activities disrupt his life, they scream at him that he's violating their privacy.
How many more princes and his wives have to live in this nightmare?
Hey, can you two keep it down?
Hey, you ever heard of a thing called privacy?
Yeah, nobody gives a shit. Will you two just shut up and go away?
Kyle attempts to use the rebranding techniques suggested to him, telling his friends that he is a victim and that he is working on himself, but they react with indifference. When he also complains about the royal couple to his friends at school, they point out that he is giving the royal couple the very attention they want. Interesting. This is a motive that happens in real life. Are we giving Meghan and Harry the very attention that they want? And in what way? Well, and when Kyle refuses to relent, they walk away from him. Kyle then finds the front of his house plastered with magazine covers featuring the prince's wife. And this lasted just a couple seconds on screen. This was just a flash, 2 seconds. And this was a complete mastery of trolling, because every single one of these covers that look made up at first sight are based on a real life cover of Meghan Markle. I might have missed some of them, but we have that Vanity Fair cover, and it says what the princess wants, and it also says lucky life. And well, let's be honest, she has had a lucky life, despite all her claims about having a rags to royal story. You cannot miss the Time magazine 100 influential people, of course, with the same posture and everything. This was great. GQ is CQ hype, and right at the bottom, what should say Meghan Markle's Annus Mirabilis. This says the Princess Annus. Well, you know, oh, this was amazing. This was just amazing. They also included the Arsewives cover. This was a bit fussy, but I think this says anthology. It was included nonetheless. All these covers had a cover version, as pun intended, in this wall that lasted only 2 seconds on screen. Even the cut, that mugshot of evil Meghan, was included too. Newsweek, quite obscure, maybe obscure for me, but many of you already knew about these covers, but they were included. And not only those Vanity Fairs, but this from Vanity Fair was barely visible on that joke. Also, Fabulous, the same posture, the same blue, the same everything. These people did their homework well. Elle, the dress, you know, the motive of the hat is to understand that this is the same person, except in this one that South Park writers went as far as to, well, you know, imply that even in a South Park episode, Meghan copies Catherine. This was masterful. At Vogue magazine of the cover, Catherine's cover of Vogue magazine, and was included in those covers of Meghan. This was brilliant. Tatler magazine, the Variety, you know, the Variety Alien magazine cover. They did a version that was a bit more subtle, like looking to the side. Weekend magazine becomes Weekday magazine, and the feminist issue, there it is. Splash magazine, same posture with the yellow skirt or the yellow whatever she has. The Life and Style, there she is too. Lifestyle mag, that cover included as well. I mean, magazines as obscure as you can imagine were included. That it was like, we did our homework, Meghan. We know who you are. We know that you have been pretending. We know that you are all about all these brand management and being a brand and not really being yourself. That is quite a burn. But well, exhibiting the brand suggested by Davis that nothing bothers him, Kyle refuses to be provoked into reacting to the couple's antics. At this, the wife accuses Kyle of victimizing her because she is ethnic, a comment that comes as a revelation to the prince. The prince then tries to provoke Kyle by walking up to Kyle's house and rubbing his blue Dodger onto the window as Kyle watches television, failing to goad Kyle into responding. This was hilarious.
Hey! Have some respect for people's privacy! Hey!
You know, that reminds me of other times that Harry has tried to use his balls to attract people's attention. Well, you might recall that too. So the next day, Kyle walks into school having adopted a new look and a more positive demeanor, telling his friends that he is carefree. So the next day, Kyle walks into school having adopted a new look and a more positive demeanor, telling his friends that he is carefree and unflappable. But learns that Butters is being beaten up in the schoolyard by Beeb Stevens after launching an unprovoked abusive tirade at her in the belief that everyone appreciates males who are strong and assertive. Well, that sounds like those hyper-masculinity influencers out there, right? Realizing that this is the result of Hammer's work, Kyle goes to the company's offices. Well, the prince and his wife are consulting with Mr. Davis to retaliate against Kyle, and this is the ultimate burn. He is talking to Megan, and he asks her, "Oh, you are already on the database. Let me search for you. Sorority girl, actress, influencer, victim." But victim, of course, you know. But the best part is not that. The best part is the text that is barely visible on one side. Client number 275, whatever, Hollywood, California. Those yoga, calligraphy, cuisine, writing, lifestyle, advocating, acting, first lady botherer, lawyer pretending, blogging, and feminism. That first lady botherer was chef's kiss. These guys know what they were doing. Kyle says that when one tries to engineer the image by which others perceive them, it just makes that person a performer instead of a human being. That is a nice morale to this story, a nice lesson. Hearing this, the prince resolves to do away with magazine covers and television appearances in favor of a more normal life, realizing what is within them defines who they are, and not commodifying oneself as a product. Oh, he wakes up.
He's right. Trying to make ourselves into a brand just turned us into products. We don't need to be a brand, do we? If it's truly what we want, then we really can get away from it all. No more magazines and Netflix shows. We really can live a normal life.
Yeah, there is a reason why there's no answer from Megan, and Harry really tries to do it one more time, but the results are not quite as expected.
Yes, I'm sure you agree, darling. We can be the people we talked about being, with no more worries about how we look or the image we project to people. What matters is what we have on the inside. Hello?
I have to tell you, the animation, the timing is perfect. It's just perfect. When this gets no response from his wife, he flips open the top half of her head and inside finds only an endless chasm from which his voice echoes. The prince leaves Hammer without her. Kyle decides to allow Ike his repeat viewings of the Queen's funeral, realizing that this is who Ike is, and that he doesn't care if this negatively affects his standing with his friends. Kyle's friends then show up at his door, telling him that he could use some time outside to relieve some of the stress from the things that he's been going through. They go to the local basketball court, When the prince asks if he can play, and they invite him to do so, he sets up his drum set right on the edge of the court, playing music as the children play basketball. This, well, as absurd as it gets, but in the end, it has a brilliant message inside all this satire. They are making the point that nobody can be truly happy if you're just pretending or playing a brand or developing your brand all the time. Like, your personal brand is what counts. How others perceive you, when, well, it will be much easier if you were just yourself. And yes, inside all this satire is this great message that I think they did very well. Either way, I would like to know what do you think about this in the comments. My Royal Rogues, my name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the Royal Rogue. And remember to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss any of my lives or my videos. Remember the two most important words? Much love and bliss.
In a video last week, I admitted that I'm an expert in nothing, and that was a very slight lie. Technically, the American educational system, for all of its faults, did decide that I do have an expertise in one thing that I spent a lot of money studying in college. Advertising. That's right. I have a Bachelor of Science from Boston University's world-class advertising program, where essentially I learned how to bullshit people. That's why they call it a BS in communication. It's just talking bullshit. With that in mind, I have been very interested in some advertisements that I've seen lately, or as we say in the biz, TV spots. See, I wasn't BSing about that BS. I know the lingo. Here is one of the TV spots I saw the other day.
There was a mother and a father who had a son. They lived in a small village and didn't have much money. But they were far away from the atrocities taking place in Bethlehem. That's all Mary and Joseph wanted. A safe place to call home.
I'll admit, I laughed out loud when I realized that the product I was watching an ad for was Jesus. And honestly, when I saw this next one, my first thought was Buddy Christ.
Buddy Christ.
And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. My man went out for cigarettes 2,000 years ago and hasn't even sent a postcard since. And someone out there would like for me to invest in his brand? No, thank you. But hey, not all ads are for me, right? I mean, most ads are explicitly not for skeptical anti-consumerist assholes like me. And these ads are super not for skeptical anti-consumerist ex-Baptist atheist assholes like me. But it seemed weird that I was seeing so many of these ads more and more often when I hardly ever even watch any TV that has ads on it. So clearly whoever is running this campaign thinks that I at least watch the same TV shows as their target demographic. And apparently, the largest TV audience in the United States is about to see these commercials in 2 weeks. So I finally decided to look into what exactly is going on here. The ads all link to hegetsus.com, a slick little site that offers people the opportunity to follow Bible reading plans, join a group of fellow fans of Jesus, or even to sign up for free text-based prayers. And it seemed like this was an attempt to get casual Christians, as we used to call them in youth group, to become more engaged with whatever church they want. And sure enough, I found an article in Ad Age from 2021 that says that the group behind the campaign found that 54% of American adults are unsure about their faith or have a nominal faith in Jesus. More than half of skeptics are open to exploring more about Jesus, and nearly all skeptics and cultural Christians believe the world would be a better place if everyone lived Christ's teachings on peace, love, and forgiveness. And you know what? I agree. From what I've read, Jesus seems like a pretty okay guy. He was anti-capitalism, pro-immigration, anti-death penalty. And it's not like one of those things where you can read a religious text and just pick and choose verses to support whatever you want. Jesus literally hulked out on people selling their wares in his temple. He was an immigrant. He was put to death by the state. You get it. For anyone who has actually read the Bible, which I think includes most ex-Christians but very few current evangelicals, we know that if Jesus of the Bible were to come back to earth right now, he would really hate the Republican Party. Not to mention the sight of all of those people wearing jewelry of the thing that he was nailed to. Mm-hmm. He probably wouldn't be a huge fan of that, especially if they bought it at the church bazaar. My point being, if a group wants to convince more people to get excited about Christianity, I would prefer it be like this, the fuzzy, nice, welcoming, progressive Jesus, and not the Nazi Jesus that a lot of Republicans like to pretend is the real Jesus these days. But of course, when it comes to religion, it's never quite that simple, is it? Because religion is more complicated than just picking up the good things and dismissing the bad things. People do that, but the ease of picking up the good stuff and throwing away the bad stuff is a privilege for the free-thinking non-theists out there. Religions, by definition, come with sets of dogma, leaders who establish and change that dogma, sermons that reinforce that dogma, congregations that normalize that dogma. And so that's when I wondered, when people go to hegetsus.com and ask to join a group, what group are they joining exactly? When they text to ask for prayers, who's praying for them? So the group's paying for the ads is, to give you a very quick summary, a shadowy group of Christian billionaires. That sounds normal and not at all concerning. Join me as we jump down that rabbit hole. Ad Age reported that the campaign is funded by an anonymous group of billionaire donors from the faith-based nonprofit, the Servant Foundation. Who's that? Great question. Sources like Christianity Daily say that the Servant Foundation is this endowment fund run by the Church of the Servant, a wealthy Methodist church in the Oklahoma City suburbs. While the fund is also overseen by the Oklahoma United Methodist Foundation, I learned that the Church of the Servant is currently attempting to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, which has been happening quite a lot to quite a number of churches in recent years, thanks to the UMC's ongoing refusal to condone same-sex marriages and other basic human rights for the LGBTQ community. So, good on those churches for wanting to disaffiliate. Not too bad, right? About half of the people attending the church that seems to be funding these ads would like to be inclusive to LGBTQ. Sure, could be worse. Well, hold on, we're not at the bottom of the rabbit hole yet, because I saw another article refer to the Servant Foundation as being based in Missouri, which made me realize that there's just a bunch of different branches of the Servant Foundation, and the Servant Foundation is actually just a DBA of the signatory. DBA stands for Doing Business As, and it's a way for a company to legally come up with an alias that lets them brand themselves in a different way for a different audience. So really, the funder of these ads is the signatory, which is run by these guys. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on, let me just turn up the contrast a little bit. There they are. The Signatory is a donor-advised fund, or DAF, dedicated to spreading evangelical Christianity until they can write the last check to the last missionary to be sent out to the last unreached people group so that the last person can hear the gospel, which I'm pretty sure is going to be on that island full of people that murder anyone who gets close. But, you know, you guys do you. That is really the only thing on their website that is sort of concrete and not some generic feel-good lorem ipsum text. And there's a reason for that. You know, the entire point of donor-advised funds is to just set up a way for wealthy people to funnel money towards their pet causes with zero accountability. As I mentioned in a video in 2021, conservatives are using DAFs as a way for the fossil fuel industry to pump money into climate change misinformation. And the Southern Poverty Law Center wrote that same year that DAFs push extremism into the mainstream by becoming the dark money ATM of the conservative movement. That one's from a Mother Jones article. For the Signatory, they're all of that with a distinct Christian flavor. In addition to the He Gets Us campaign, the Signatory has also given money to creationist kooks, Answers in Genesis, and SPLC-designated hate group Alliance Defending Freedom, as reported by Chrissy Stroop over at Religious Dispatches, who I was very glad to find because my eyes immediately crossed while skimming the list of hundreds of ministries the Signatory's godly gazillionaires support. Because of the way DAFs operate, we have no way to know who the billionaires are who are funding this campaign tax-free, and therefore what their ultimate motivations might be. Luckily, many billionaires are, contrary to popular belief, incredibly stupid, which is how I know that at least one of them funding this campaign is David Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby. Green went on Glenn Beck's show last November to brag that we are about to see the He Gets Us ads he funded on the right after he talked about winning that court case that allowed his company to stop their employees from using their own personal insurance to pay for birth control pills. He literally segued from celebrating denying women's health care to complaining about being hated for being a Christian to bragging about paying like $14 million for 60 seconds of airtime during the genius. So yeah, the touchy-feely ads for Jesus may have a dark underside. Shocking, I know. Next up, why those Cool Ranch Doritos aren't actually as cool as you've been led to believe. While researching all of this, I came across a number of people who think that this is all going to backfire for the religious right, mostly because, like, if you have to advertise for Jesus, that means Jesus has already failed as a product. I'm not quite that optimistic. I think in general, people, especially smart people who think of themselves as free thinkers, underestimate the power of advertising. I assure you that Doritos and Bud Light and Coca-Cola are not in financial trouble. Their products are selling just fine, but they still have a healthy advertising budget, and you're probably going to see them during this. You aren't immune to marketing just because you notice it when it happens to be a product you personally find repugnant. I suspect that these ads will draw in a certain subset of people, namely people who have that low-level belief in God, but who lack community and connection, especially these days as loneliness and social isolation become really serious barriers to good mental health. Religion and other forms of magical thinking and superstition, they succeed when fear and uncertainty reign. And I think we're in a time where that's happening. According to Christianity Today, He Gets Us doesn't vet what churches sign up to be the ones answering those calls for help. So a commercial about how Jesus invited everyone to the table could easily lead, say, an at-risk closeted gay teen to a church that sponsors conversion therapy, just to pull the first worst-case scenario that happened to come to my mind. And just that one slight possibility is enough for me to, unfortunately, not be able to easily dismiss this as a waste of some billionaire's chump change. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.
The biggest scientific problem for atheists lies in the nature of the universe itself.
Does it now? Please, go on.
The Big Bang is the theory that holds that the universe began with the explosion outward of a high-density pinpoint of matter.
Is it? Are you sure?
Which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
Except, no, it doesn't.
How does an entire universe full of energy simply appear out of nothing?
It didn't appear out of nothing. For crying out loud.
And it wasn't.
Right. Let's hear out the rest of what Ben Shapiro has to say about the Big Bang and the fine-tuning argument uninterrupted, and then I'll debunk it.
The original skepticism of the Big Bang theory was driven in large measure by objections to that similarity. The very specific conditions under which our universe was created that allowed for the development of intelligent human life are often used by believers as proof of God's hand. The so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life is extraordinary. If, for example, the strength of the Big Bang had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe just would not exist the way that it does right now.
If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever.
Atheists claim that just because you won the lottery doesn't mean that you won because somebody intended for you to win the lottery. Somebody had to win. But that doesn't answer the question. If you kept winning the lottery over and over and over and over again, billions of times, at some point, you might suppose that somebody was cheating.
Last week, we dealt with Ben's most prominently defended argument for God's existence in his documentary titled The Atheist Delusion, that being the argument from change. And in this final take of his documentary, I'll be dealing with his second most prominent argument for God's existence, the supposed fine-tuning of the universe. I know, I originally said that I was only going to make 3 responses to Ben's documentary, but some trilogies have their finale split into 2, and so the finale still only counts as 1.
That still only counts as 1!
And let's face it, my Trinity still makes 1 billion times more sense than the Holy Trinity of Christianity. On this, even Ben would agree.
Debunked.
Before sinking our teeth in, however, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Blinkist, my new favourite workout buddy. Talking of working out, Blinkist is to books what supplements are to meals. Whereas supplements provide key nutrients, Blinkist provides key ideas from non-fiction bestsellers in minutes. And with them having over 5,500 titles covering 27 different categories, I've got company for marathons more. 2 of my goals this year are to 1. Significantly improve my cardiovascular fitness, and 2. Digest more books, and Blinkist has proven extremely useful on both fronts. It ensures that time flies by, and along with it calories, and it helps me to decide which books to eventually buy. As Socrates warned, it is a shame for us to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which the body is capable. And if you type in Socrates to Blinkist, you get a wide range of excellent content. From blinks on free speech to Plato's The Republic to the story of philosophy from Will Durant. By clicking my link below, you can get 25% of Blinkist Premium, which features their Blinkist Connect, allowing you to enjoy 2 memberships for the price of 1. Yes, that's 2 memberships for the price of 1. I, for example, have been giving my editor access to all that Blinkist has to offer, and he's been recommending psychology content ever since. What's more, you get 7 days free, during which you can cancel if you're not getting use out of it. So there's really nothing to lose. If you'd like a buddy on your journey to self-actualization, then please be sure to check out the link below. Alright, Let's sink our teeth in and address each of Ben's claims at a time.
The biggest scientific problem for atheists lies in the nature of the universe itself. The Big Bang is the theory that holds that the universe began with the explosion outward of a high-density pinpoint of matter.
If you've been watching my content for a while, or indeed just about any content in the atheist niche, you'll know that the Big Bang Theory does not state that the universe began with an explosion, nor that it had matter in the explosion. Rather, the universe expanded, not exploded, and that's not a trivial difference. It wasn't an explosion within space, but rather an expansion off space. And when our universe was in a dense state, it didn't have matter at all. Matter didn't turn up for another 370,000 years after the initial expansion. To put that into perspective, that's longer than we Homo sapiens have existed. So in his introduction to the fine-tuning argument, Ben has made two claims about the Big Bang, and has got both of them wrong. For a man that boasts that he's in possession of the facts, for a man who claims to be an expert,
Become an expert.
that's not a great start, is it? I mean, really, digest this, and bite down especially hard if you happen to find Ben persuasive in other areas. Because these non-trivial mistakes that Ben has stated extremely confidently could have been prevented by him simply checking his script once. A simple, single Google search. Hence, the extent of research he's put into his documentary that aggressively demonizes atheists and thus encourages bigotry towards us, which I tackled at length in my first installment, is predicated on the most basic of errors. Seriously, let that sink in. But Ben did state these errors confidently. I've got to give him that, so I guess we'll move on. What I definitely won't give him, however, is what he claimed next.
Which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
Oh, does it now? The Bible sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible. Really? Well,
as if you
within
wanted
his
to.
documentary, Ben presents the creationist/intelligent design proponent Stephen Meyer as an expert on biology.
Stephen Meyer, an intelligent design advocate.
And the reason I bring this up is that since Ben is in the business of presenting creationists as experts in fields that they don't have expertise in, let's play his game. Here's a few reasons that a prominent creationist out there, Answers in Genesis, very much disagree with Ben. As a side note, I am so in the wrong career. Look at that! 17 million raised in, quote, charity.
Wow.
And then there's the Daily Wire with over 1 million paying subscribers. Screw it. I'm going to go Christ for cash. Bugger it. I'm going to convert. I'm going to write a book about how atheism just... I don't know, I'm going to go make money. Anyhow. First, and unlike Ben, Answers in Genesis note that matter only turned up, according to the Big Bang, after the universe expanded. But like Ben, they also claim that the Big Bang is a theory of how the universe came into existence.
No, God!
It's not, but we'll get to that in a bit. Anyhow, as they write, the Bible teaches that God created the universe in 6 days, per Genesis 1 and Exodus 20:11. They continue. It is clear from the context in Genesis that these were days in the ordinary sense, that is 24-hour days, since they are bounded by evening and morning and occur in an ordered list, second day, third day, etc. Conversely, the Big Bang teaches the universe has evolved over billions of years. So there's the first major difference. The Bible has an eloquence of no wasted time for the bread to bake, so to speak. Whereas the Big Bang has 10 billion years until our solar system coalesces, and a further 4 billion years until we, God's supposed chosen, turn up.
Which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
Here's another 2 ways in which the creation story of the Bible doesn't at all sound like the Big Bang theory. The Bible says that the Earth was created before the stars and the trees were created before the sun. However, the Big Bang teaches the exact opposite. The Bible tells us that the Earth was created as a paradise. The secular model teaches it was created as a molten blob. Putting aside the loaded language of Answers in Genesis, these 2 divergencies are pretty damn significant, are they not? Either the Bible or the Big Bang has got it backwards. Not only do they not sound the same, but they actively contradict one another. When even Answers in Genesis, a laughingstock pseudoscientific organisation, debunks Ben, you'd hope that maybe, just maybe, Ben will one day self-reflect just enough to drop his confidence by a margin.
Which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
Except it doesn't, does it? Oh, and while we're on it, here's a perfectly relevant difference pertaining to how matter came about. Get this, the Bible claims that the Earth and the universe were made all together at once. The Big Bang, on the other hand, claims that the crucibles within us are traceable to stars. As Lawrence Krauss put it,
So forget Jesus, the stars died so that you could be here today, okay? And anyway.
But to put one more nail in Ben's crucifix, here's another salient point made by the likes that Ben teams up with when it suits him. Many people don't realise that the Big Bang is a story not only about the past, but also the future. The most popular version of the Big Bang teaches that the universe will expand forever and eventually run out of usable energy. According to the story, it will remain that way forever in a state that astronomers call heat death. But the Bible teaches that the world will be judged and remade. Paradise will be restored. The Big Bang denies this crucial biblical teaching.
Which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
Does it? Does it really sound similar? Or is it that you recognise the overwhelming evidence in favour of the Big Bang, and thus are bending over backwards to reinterpret scripture like a heretic? To quote Answers in Genesis, they, Ben in this case, choose to reinterpret the plain teachings of scripture in an attempt to make it mesh with secular beliefs about origins. Answers in Genesis are wrong, of course, to say that the Big Bang is secular. The Big Bang is no more secular than thermodynamics or a spherical Earth is secular, but they are correct in their central statement here. Theists like Ben reinterpret their supposed holy works to fit Big Bang cosmology, and it's frankly hilarious. Watching religious people contort their contradictory medieval books to accommodate contemporary knowledge, it's pretty cute.
How does an entire universe full of energy simply appear out of nothing?
Magic.
Oh, I know this one. It's easy. It didn't. Again, if Ben had bothered to do any damn research before confidently spewing such nonsense, he'd have known this. When it comes to the Big Bang, there's an extremely prominent fallacy that comes up, namely the equivocation fallacy, which occurs when someone uses the same term in different contexts without distinguishing between them. To give a relevant example, we say that there are laws in the legal sense if they're being rules of conduct prescribed and enforced by a controlling authority. But we also say that there are laws in the scientific sense if they're being statements based on repeated experiments that describe or predict a range of natural phenomena. Theists, however, tend to equate these uses, claiming that the scientific laws are prescribed by the big guy upstairs. And when it comes to the Big Bang, the equivocation is on the word began. Just as we would say that you, for instance, began to exist after your father and mother engaged in afternoon delight, or fine, after dark delight, we likewise say that the universe began to exist 13.7 billion years ago. Notice that in both cases we're not saying that the atoms which comprise the entity came into being from nothing. Theists like Ben fallaciously equate on the word began and thus claim that at the beginning of the Big Bang everything came into existence, but it didn't. Funny enough, Pope Pius XII enthusiastically made the same leap as Ben, only to have George Lemaitre, that is, the Catholic priest that came up with the Big Bang Theory in the first place, to speak out against him. Now, as for the clip Ben shows, I'm not sure where he got it from. It could be from another documentary, or he could have commissioned someone else's voice. But in any case, this makes him 3 for 3 on getting basic facts about the Big Bang Theory wrong.
Debunked.
Despite all of this, and moving on, Ben then insisted, if we recall, that skeptics objected to the Big Bang precisely because of its alleged biblical confirming nature.
The original skepticism of the Big Bang Theory was driven in large measure by objections to that similarity.
To support this claim, Ben has offered no evidence, and so our response is, of course, that which is asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Whether or not the universe began to exist out of nothing has no bearing on atheism or theism. It's consistent with both. Aquinas, for instance, famously objected to the Kalam on account of it being perfectly possible for God to have created the universe from eternity. Likewise, whether the universe popped into being or not is compatible with atheism either way. At the end of the day, be we theists or atheists, we're all going to have to bite into a big fat disgusting brute fact. A fact that exists with no explanation. It's just that atheists bite this before assuming all sorts of additional baggage. Now, if you're interested in the discussion behind why we must all buy a brute fact, then please see my video link below. Anyhow, let's move on.
The very specific conditions under which our universe was created that allowed for the development of intelligent human life are often used by believers as proof of God's hand. The so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life is extraordinary.
So first of all, notice Ben's emphasis on specifically intelligent human life.
Of intelligent human life.
This distinction might seem subtle, but it's not. If we're considering specifically human life, that is specifically one primate that evolved on the plains of Africa, as opposed to life altogether, then Ben's fine-tuning argument is trivial, even if we grant it outright. To see why, let's give Douglas Adams the floor. This is a hefty clip, I have to say, but it's a brilliant piece of commentary on teleological thinking.
We always ask ourselves why, because we look for intention around us, because we always intend, we do something with intention. You know, we boil an egg in order to eat it. So we look at the rocks and we look at the trees and we wonder what intention is here, even though it doesn't have intention. So we think, so what did this person who made this world intend it for? And this is the point where you think, well, it fits me very well. You know, the caves and the forests and the stream and the mammoths. He must have made it for me. I mean, there's no other conclusion you can come to. And it's rather like a puddle waking up one morning. I know they don't normally do this, but allow me, I'm a science fiction writer. A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, oh, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it?
Made for you.
It must have been made to have me in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the sun rises, and he's continuing to narrate the story about this hole being made to have him in it. And the sun rises, and gradually the puddle is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And by the time the puddle ceases to exist, it's still thinking, it's still trapped in this idea that the hole was there for it. And if we think the world is here for us, we will continue to destroy it in the way that we've been destroying it.
Douglas concludes his insight by suggesting that we protect our planet, which no doubt will trigger those who are not so interested in preventing climate change, like Ben, who suggests that people just sell their houses if rising water levels flood their homes.
You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
But Douglas's point on teleology is on the money. Religions have had an awful habit of getting everything backwards. From the earth being made before the stars, to woman being made from man, to the earth adapting to our needs. No. Per evolution by natural selection, it is us that has adapted to the earth. The reason we sit so snugly in the hole we find ourselves in is because we adapted to the hole, not the other way around. Now, while appealing to evolution is perfectly fine according to many theists, and even most Christians, Ben evidently rejects evolution, just like his teammate Dennis Prager. And him presenting the creationist/intelligent design proponent Stephen Meyer as an expert on biology reveals just how much of science Ben rejects. It's pretty awkward, and it's explicitly for religious reasons. But to get back to the point, by specifying his fine-tuning argument to human intelligence, Ben's argument is very weak. To illustrate why, suppose we threw 10 20-sided dice one at a time and recorded the sequence. And then your friend, hypothetically, let's call him Ben, insists that we be flabbergasted by how unlikely it would be for us to roll the exact same sequence again. In fact, he's so flabbergasted that he aggressively and obnoxiously accuses you of being delusional if you won't infer immediately from this mind-blowing fact that God exists, and that he really doesn't like your foreskin. Seems absurd, right? That is because it is. The fact of the matter is that we don't have a damn clue what sequences allow for intelligent life. For all we know, it might be all even outcomes, or it could be that pretty much any outcome permits life in some form or another. We haven't a clue. The central premise that Ben has to establish is that intelligent life altogether is rare. That in the billions of solar systems scattered throughout the observable and indeed unobservable universe, including, should they exist, other dimensions and so forth, that intelligent life, that is, life that's so intelligent in fact, that its intellectual stars don't even fact-check the most basic of claims, is rare. Oh, human arrogance. How you disgust me. Now I have more to say here, but I'll save my words for now.
The so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life is extraordinary.
But again, is it extraordinary? Sure, we can specify that human life requires specific conditions, but this is just the puddle being flabbergasted by how snugly the hole in the ground holds it. The rain feeds it, and the sun keeps it at the perfect temperature.
If, for example, the strength of the Big Bang had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe just would not exist the way that it does right now.
If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever.
Right. First of all, Ben has quote-mined Richard Dawkins to make out that he was endorsing the fine-tuning argument, but the full context reveals that he wasn't, and you can see me expand upon this in my last instalment. Second, Ben insists that if the initial conditions of the universe were different, then the universe wouldn't exist the way that it does right now.
The universe just would not exist the way that it does right now.
This is no different to him referencing specifically intelligent human life. You know, pointing out after we've rolled the dice that if we were to re-roll the dice, the chances that we'd get exactly the same result would be very unlikely. And my response is the same. Yes, the universe would be different if the universe was different. Many will. Much insight. Ben's obsession over specifically human intelligent life and the universe existing specifically in the way that it does right now renders his argument trivial per the dice analogy I gave just a moment ago. We can grant his argument and it gets us nowhere. But if, as we go on, we still man his argument, and we will, so that it's not so tightly constricted, there's much more to be said.
If, for example, the strength of the Big Bang had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power.
The strength of the Big Bang? Based on the 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, perhaps Ben is referring to the cosmological constant, which more than less is a form of energy that acts in opposition to gravity. And even if he's not, the cosmological constant is recognised as the creme de la creme of supporting fine-tuning arguments, and so let's roll with it. In a nutshell, if we could rewind to the initial state of the Big Bang and ever so slightly turn the dial of the cosmological constant one way, then the universe would have collapsed in on itself. Alternatively, if we were ever so slightly to turn it the other way, then atoms today would be light years apart. And in either case, so proponents of fine-tuning claim, we would have no life at all. Therefore, God must have finely tuned it. So what's some of the objections to this argument? Well, let me give you 3 of my favourites, and let's set up the first for a question. Why do theists like Ben so insult God's intelligence and power by limiting him to specific conditions? This is God we're talking about, the Almighty. According to theists, life is not purely physical. Indeed, they insist that at least some of us who happen to be convinced of absurd propositions will live on after death. Intelligent life, then, can thrive without any physical conditions. Couple this with the fact that theists tend to believe in unembodied entities such as angels, and it becomes clear that by their own commitments, no less, the conditions required for intelligent life are not precise, are they? God can maintain intelligent life under numerous conditions. In fact, with God being all-powerful, he could surely create intelligent life under pretty much any condition. Unless you can show a contradiction, there's no reason to limit the unlimited, is there? To think that God couldn't create life unless atoms are specifically spaced apart, that there's a precise number of dimensions, or that the cosmological constant is ever so slightly tuned, is to fail to understand his alleged attributes. It's an insult to God. This is God we're talking about. Who's to say he couldn't create life that spans light years? I mean, even if we just consider the infinitesimal areas of the universe that we can investigate, we find life all over it. Life exists in ultra-big forms and ultra-small, from the ceilings of the sky to the bedrock of the oceans, from the heart of volcanoes to the frozen tundra of Antarctica, where all real estate is owned by Aquaman. Sure, there's not necessarily intelligent life everywhere, but what even is intelligent life? How do we measure it? In any case, I'd bet that those penguins with Aquaman check their sources as often as Ben does. I mean, as long as they don't check their sources at all, then they're on par with Ben. And for me, at least, this objection alone completely debunks fine-tuning arguments. To limit the unlimited in the pursuit of proving the existence of the unlimited is bonkers. It reveals that proponents lean on their intuitions as opposed, ironically enough, to their intellect.
Debunked.
As a second objection, could it be that proponents of fine-tuning are simply repeating the mistakes of their predecessors? Just as we once thought the Earth to be the only planet in our solar system, but later discovered that it isn't, and just as we once thought the solar system to be the only solar system in the universe, but later discovered that it also isn't, perhaps we'll one day discover that the Earth is but one of many universes. Or, you know what, forget the multiverse consideration and simply muster the humility to ponder just how big the universe is. If someone were to travel at the speed of light, they could circumnavigate the Earth's equator 7.5 times in a second. Indeed, light speed is insanely fast. But if the traveller wanted to traverse the diameter of the observable universe, they'd need to travel at, get this, the speed of light for 93 billion years, which is nearly 7 times longer than since the universe's initial expansion occurred. Yeah, the observable universe has an utterly absurd diameter, and yet this is just the observable universe. As for the size of the unobservable universe, who knows? Now, don't you think that in all that vastness, it's possible that there's areas where no electrons reside, areas where atoms can't form, and areas where, maybe, the cosmological constant is different? I, for one, see every reason to take these possibilities seriously. Until recently, our humility, if we want to call it that, was certain that gravity functioned the same everywhere. But it doesn't. Why be so certain to apply our already debunked arrogance to the entire cosmos? Why repeat the mistakes of our ancestors, particularly our religious ancestors? If we're willing to grant the aforementioned suggestions, if we're willing to say that the universe is far more diverse than we thought, then we have a simple explanation for intelligent life that doesn't require us to bite down on, at a later date, all sorts of theodicies. All it requires is a big old bite of humility, and it's not like we haven't swallowed our fill already. The scientific revolution has bent our ego over a barrel, and good riddance. Anyhow, to conclude this objection, let me yield the floor to the physicist Leonard Susskind, who gives us an insightful comparison with liquid water.
It's more or less like asking, why do we, by accident, happen to live on a planet which happens to be at just the right temperature for liquid water to exist? That's a narrow range. Not as narrow, it's not as much of a knife edge as the cosmological constant. Why is that? Well, the answer is very simple. On planets where there can't be water, there can't be life. So it's true, a very small fraction of the planets in the universe are at the right temperature for water to exist. Where do we live? We live in the only place we can live, where water exists. Same kind of picture. Universe very big, very diverse, many different environments, a huge slew of different possibilities. And among these possibilities, in a few small pockets of the universe, conditions are right for life, and that's where life exists.
Debunked.
As a final objection, let's suppose that Ben's fine-tuning argument is sound. That is, that it was indeed extremely unlikely that any intelligent life emerged in the universe, and yet it has. In other words, let's tentatively grant all of Ben's premises. Where does this leave us? Does it get us to an intelligent agent? No, it doesn't. But let's go further and assume it does. Let's assume Ben's fine-tuning argument gets us all the way to intelligent agency. Let's grant all of this. Finally, we're at Heaven's Gate, right? The God of the Bible stands before us. Hell no, definitely not. To scratch the surface, who's to say that there was only one intelligent creator? Or even that the intelligent creator is still alive? I mean, the Mona Lisa was created by Leonardo da Vinci, but it doesn't follow that da Vinci is still alive, does it? Now, one might be thinking, Steve, that's not a fair analogy, because da Vinci didn't create the Mona Lisa out of nothing. Rather, he rearranged pre-existing material. To which I retort, yes, that's another great point. Even if we grant the entirety of Ben's argument, in fact, the Stillman version of his argument, we're still left, as Christopher Hitchens might have put it, empty-handed, with all of our work still ahead of us to get anywhere near the theism of the three monotheistic faiths. And I really don't think that most proponents ever really digest this objection. To rephrase it in my favourite form, if the universe was finely tuned to have no intelligent life until, very specifically, 14 billion years had elapsed, and then finally, out of the embers of several mass extinctions and billions of years of evolution, an intelligent mammalian ape would finally appear, then I think it's exceedingly unlikely that the fine-tuner is all-loving and all-powerful, don't you? The idea that an all-powerful, all-loving God would choose to finely tune the gratuitous evil that has produced us is so hilariously absurd as to be an insult to human integrity, let alone intelligence. So there's my 3 favourite objections. If you'd like to see a few more of them, then may I suggest that you take a look at my Arguments for God's Existence tier list. In that video, I do my best to give what I consider to be the most potent objections to all of the most common arguments wielded by apologists. If you're into theology, I think there's a decent chance that video will aid you in your pursuit of truth. Well, that's that. That's me done with Ben's documentary, The Atheist Delusion. When I set out, I wanted to ensure that I give each element the time that it deserves. From Ben's frankly abusive rhetoric, to his many logical fallacies, to his lack of references, to his quote mining and misrepresentations, to his poor argumentation, I wanted to address it all. And I thank you for joining me on this journey, as indeed I have. And I'd also like to thank, again, Blinkist for supporting 2 of the episodes, and urge once again my fellow apes to check the link out below for 25% off. Anyhow, what's the goal from here, huh? Well, I'm considering taking on Matt Walsh's What is a Woman documentary, or maybe Jordan Peterson's Exodus, or you know what, maybe it's time to take Dennis Prager's Masters program. Who knows? But if any of this sounds like it's up your street, and if you found value in my takes on Ben Shapiro, then please consider becoming a patron or YouTube member. I've got big plans for the channel, but without the support of legends like you, I won't be able to see them through to fruition.
We need to talk about the junk signs being used to ignore 911 calls, neo-Nazis demonstrating outside of a Broadway play, and the absolute clown of a juror in the criminal probe of Trump and his allies. So we're going to talk about all that on today's brand new Sunday Philip DeFranco show, so welcome back, hit that like button, and let's just jump into it. Starting with the fact that a juror in the criminal probe of Trump and his allies may have seriously fucked shit up, all in the pursuit of 15 minutes of fame. Also, for some background, this is relating to the investigation into attempts to overturn the election in Georgia. As part of that probe, which is widely seen as one of the biggest legal threats to Trump, a special grand jury was convened. That jury spending 8 whole months investigating the matter to make a report and recommendations that Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis will then use to decide whether or not to bring charges against anyone, or because the special grand jury itself does not have the power to bring indictments. And actually, until recently, we had very little information about the contents of the jury's report or what recommendations they made. Though notably, a judge did release part of their report last week, which showed that the grand jury recommended charges against 1 or more witnesses who they believe committed perjury during their testimonies. But it was unclear how many people that included, which witnesses, or if other charges had been recommended in relation to the violations of state election laws, which I mean really is the crux of this whole case. The thing is though, that changed this week. We have gotten a lot of information, and in fact maybe too much information from the foreperson of the special grand jury, a 30-year-old woman named Emily Coors. Where with the jury now dissolved, jurors are able to speak to the press, though they're unable to share many aspects of the case. And Coors has been shockingly quick to seize onto that opportunity and the enticing spotlight that it provides. They're going on an absolutely bizarre media tour over the last few days and speaking to multiple outlets. And understand, this whole tour has been absolutely wild for a number of reasons. The first, at the very top, is that Coors has been widely criticized for how casually she's been talking about this whole thing, and almost seems like she's having this kind of weird, twisted fun with all of it, with many pointing to this clip of an interview she did with CNN where she's discussing the number of people who have been charged. Or we're talking about massive revelations that literally haven't been publicly discussed until now. And the entire time she's being like weird and giddy and coy, like she knows someone has a crush on you, but she's not gonna tell.
There are indictments recommended, of course. Is it more than 12 people? Is it more than 20 people?
I think if you look at the page numbers of the report, there's about 6 pages in the middle that got cut out. Allow for spacing. It's not a short list.
Not a short list. Would you characterize it as 20-ish people?
Not really.
I can't say I counted.
Okay. More than a dozen, though, I think I'd heard you say in another interview.
I believe so. That's probably a good assumption.
Now, on the note of Trump, she did tease out more in an interview with the New York Times where, when asked if jurors had recommended the former president, she responded, "You're not going to be shocked. It's not rocket science." And adding, "It's not going to be some giant plot twist. You probably have a fair idea of what may be in it, and trying very hard to say it delicately." What the fuck is wrong with you? How is this joke of a human being connected to this case? And understand, these are only little bits. This is not where the insanity ends. There were also a bunch of other absolutely wild moments in other interviews.
Did you personally want to hear from the former president?
I wanted to hear from the former president, but honestly, I kind of wanted to subpoena the former president because I got to swear everybody in. And so I thought it'd be really cool to get 60 seconds with President Trump of me looking at him and being like, "Do you solemnly swear?" And me getting to swear him in. I kind of just thought that would be an awesome moment. I can see how trying to get the former president to come talk to us would have been a year in negotiation by itself. I'd be fascinated by what he said, but do you think he would have come in and said anything groundbreaking, or just the same kind of thing we've heard? So at some point, you don't need to hear 50 people say the same thing. You know what I mean? At some point, you kind of start to get the gist. My coolest moment was shaking Rudy Giuliani's hand. That was really cool for me. I made a point of stopping them and being like, "Wait, before we go back to this, can I shake your hand? Because it's an honor to meet the guy." It was really neat for me.
And so with all this, we've seen so many people criticizing her, saying she clearly doesn't take this seriously, with one news anchor painting an absolutely fucking bonkers picture of this woman and how she's handled herself throughout this incredibly important process.
Okay. What we have in these interviews is a window into the thought process of a special grand jury that heard evidence in perhaps the most legally perilous investigation of a former president in American history. A special grand jury led by someone who has never before participated in the most basic part of our democracy, voting. Someone who, during proceedings, drew sketches of witnesses like Senator Lindsey Graham and former Trump aide Mark Short, and who swore in at least one witness, I am not kidding here, holding a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles popsicle stick.
But, and this is a key thing, her actions both in and out of the courtroom aren't just notable because they're so damn weird. They very well could have very significant ramifications, with experts saying it is very, very unusual for grand juries to speak to the press, period, much less in the totally flippant way she did.
This is a horrible idea, and I guarantee you that prosecutors are wincing watching her go on this. It's a prosecutor's nightmare. Mark my words, Donald Trump's team is going to make a motion, if there's an indictment, to dismiss that indictment based on grand jury impropriety.
But this mental child's selfish decision to try and milk this for all it's worth could literally jeopardize the whole case. It's already being reported that lawyers close to several witnesses are preparing to use Cora's remarks to try and quash any possible indictments in Georgia on the grounds that her comments will taint any charges in the investigation. And beyond that, not only could her actions put this case in jeopardy, but they could also hurt future cases. Right? According to ABC News, Cora's appears to have stopped short of explicitly violating the special grand jury's charter that prohibits her from sharing any information about their deliberations, but experts agreed that her public remarks could be cited in future litigation, possibly as evidence of bias in a motion to dismiss a case or in a motion to change venues. And beyond all that, her comments also simply undermine public confidence in the judicial process, with the outlet's chief legal analyst explaining she shouldn't be doing this. It isn't helpful to the perception of the objectivity of the criminal justice system, and it starts to feel like she's putting pressure on the district attorney to actually move forward with charges. Which is why I want to end this story to say to Coors, because I know you're watching, if you're acting like this on TV, don't be stupid. Well, I guess it's a little too late for that. And then, anti-Semitism is rising in the US, and the latest example is this really disturbing neo-Nazi protest outside of a Broadway show this week. Where the musical is called Parade, and it just started previews in New York City, and it's about the true story of a Jewish factory manager named Leo Frank, who was convicted of murdering a 13-year-old girl in Georgia in 1913, and after his sentence was commuted, he was murdered by a lynch mob. With a consensus among historians being that Frank was falsely accused of the crime and that the trial was heavily influenced by false testimony and anti-Semitic media coverage. And in fact, he received a posthumous pardon back in 1986, and his case and the coverage around it actually led to the creation of the Anti-Defamation League. And Ben Platt, who won a Tony Award for Dear Evan Hansen, is playing Frank in the show, which had its first preview showing on Tuesday night, which a group of neo-Nazis stood outside of, telling audiences they were supporting the story of a pedophile and saying other gross and violent things about Jewish people, even handing anti-Semitic flyers out to people attending the show. And as far as the group, they've actually been identified to be part of an organization that I won't say the name of because they don't deserve the attention, but notably they are known to be the largest membership-based neo-Nazi group in the the country, with one person who attended the show and witnessed the protest describing the demonstration as absolutely wild and genuinely scary. Protests that have been strongly condemned, including by the producers of the musical, who released a statement saying, "If there is any remaining doubt out there about the urgency of telling this story in this moment in history, the vileness on display last night should put it to rest. We stand by the valiant Broadway cast that brings this vital story to life each night." With Ben Platt also taking to Instagram to talk to his followers about what happened.
And it was definitely very ugly and scary, but a wonderful reminder of why we're telling this particular story.
Because this comes at a time, like I said, where anti-Semitism is on the rise in the U.S. And you have people across the country, whether it be some no-name bigoted fuck to the likes of Kanye West, sparking hateful incidents across the country. You got motherfuckers out in the world like more concerned that there's a book in a child's school that mentions like history or gay people rather than fucking Nazis. We're seeing the same anti-Semitism that Parade is about still infiltrating the streets of New York in 2023. And then, so data brokers create shadow profiles on you that include a frightening amount of personal details. These insights are then used by scammers, total strangers, insurance companies, banks, businesses, and even the government. I mean, it's so annoying how companies collect, aggregate, and trade your personal information without you knowing it. Data brokers, marketing brokers, financial information brokers all sell this information to third parties, or they use it for themselves. And the process of deleting that information feels like a job that never ends, but thanks to a fantastic sponsor of the show, Incogni, they'll do it for you. There are data brokers selling financial information such as credit scores to banks and credit companies, leading to increased insurance rates and loan denials that can directly affect you. And nobody wants their home address out there. Info like your name, email, home address, social security number, it gets collected and sold over and over again. It can feel out of control. So enlisting Incogni to take on the process of removing your data off the market, it just makes sense. To protect your privacy, and go to incogni.com/DeFranco, and the first 100 people to use code DeFranco will get 20% off of Incogni. It's incogni.com/DeFranco, and use code DeFranco to get your personal data off the market. And then be careful when you're calling 911, because what you say and how you say it could actually help land you behind bars. Or at least that's what this piece from ProPublica is revealed. Right? Because at the center of all this, you have a man by the name of Tracy Harpster and his so-called 911 call analysis. Harpster was a police detective from a small town, and after attending a course at the FBI, he decided to pursue a graduate degree. And during that time, he published a paper claiming they could figure out if someone was guilty of a crime based on their 911 call, which was then later turned into a study alongside 2 colleagues. So that sounds pretty fantastical, right? Almost like those channels on YouTube that claim to look at police interrogations and show the signs of someone being deceptive. But here's the thing, as fun as many of those channels are, the reality is there's almost no way to consistently tell if someone's lying just based on their body language. But that doesn't stop so-called experts like Harpster from thinking it could apply to vocal cues, and there's even a whole 911 cop scale checklist and other training that, when combined together, allegedly gave a better idea if the caller is behind the crime. These include things like giving out too much information in a call, an alleged sign that you're trying to waste time. Although at the same time, you're fucked if you only answer what's asked, right? Too much information, guilty. Too little, guilty. Asking, huh? To a dispatcher's question, you're the goddamn killer. Or let's say you're like now 24-year-old Riley Spittler, who screamed, "Oh my God, my life is over," on a 911 call after accidentally shooting his brother. Or because a detective trained by Harpster concluded that it was too much of a me mindset and that it was intentional, landing Spittler in prison for murder for years. So he ultimately managed to appeal the case to just manslaughter due to the accidental nature of the killing and the fact that this analysis is shoddy at best. Since then, Harpster has claimed to have expanded his research, gotten better data, and uses this to go around the country teaching his methods to hundreds of police departments, often for a hefty fee. Right, so a guy with very little scientific background claiming that he can do this would normally be grounds for skepticism. But in the world of law enforcement, they will cling to junk science left and right if it helps get a conviction. Right, remember, for a while, polygraph tests were lauded as the next big thing. Now, they're not even admissible as evidence in court. However, Harpster's methodologies got a big boost when the FBI featured his research shortly after he wrote it in a bulletin they sent to law enforcement across the country. With one of the issues being that paper wasn't even peer-reviewed at that time. Also, Harpster and his colleagues used just 100 sample calls to make their data, and then they tested their method on that same data, something known as double dipping. And making matters worse is the fact that 100 sample calls isn't enough to factor in things like callers' race, economic group, where they grew up, whether they're neurodivergent, and so on. All of those play major factors in how people speak. Now, a thing that should be noted, this isn't exactly a major problem if they also followed the rest of standard academic procedure, like having other researchers conduct similar studies. But after the FBI prematurely sent out the research, the genie was out of the bottle and Harpster was off to the races. He works on consulting police forces and prosecutors around the U.S. to try and get people behind bars based on their 911 calls. And although most law enforcement officials claim, hey, this is just one single tool in our toolbox, that appears to contradict multiple emails and court cases that ProPublica looked at, where they found that the only real evidence prosecutors had was Harpster's cheat sheet. Now, some of those cases have since been successfully appealed, but the fact that it was even allowed at all is pretty appalling, as is the number of prosecutors and officers who swear by his work. And one of the things here is that we're likely going to see an uptick in convictions that use this method rapid because it took years for it to get off the ground and into courtrooms. There wasn't enough precedent to bring it into trials as evidence to be examined, and Harpster didn't want to take the stand himself, likely over fears of being debunked and ruining any chances of precedent being set. So that's when his training efforts really took off. He began training so-called experts, and prosecutors slowly began introducing it into courts, right? Not as evidence, but rather part of an officer's experience and training, which means it shouldn't be considered as strongly by a jury, but it also means it's susceptible to less scrutiny. Or as one prosecutor instructed, have the officers testify why this 911 call is inconsistent with an innocent caller, consistent with someone with a guilty mind. Harpster would add the prosecutors should reinforce all the incriminating sections of the call. Another prosecutor writing omissions, lack of emotion, over-emotion, failure to act appropriately. Juries love it. It's easy for them to understand. And this is even before it's been recognized as science by many courts, and it's still swaying juries. But eventually, after enough of that was done, it helped establish the missing precedent that was needed in order to start introducing its analysis as true evidence with experts. It's kind of like how things that aren't true just become facts. Take the idea that Napoleon was short. Turns out he wasn't. It started as propaganda before being quoted in academic sources, and the next thing you know, boom, it's a fact. Napoleon's a tiny dude. And it takes a ton of work to undo that. But again, with what we're talking about today, there is a serious lack of scientific evidence to back any of this up. Even one of the researchers responsible has been so wary of how this has been used that they've distanced themselves from the entire work. And since Harpster's study, others have been done, including 2 by the FBI, and none of them back his claims. The FBI even saying that the indicators were so inconsistent that they often went in the opposite direction of what was previously found, with the FBI even trying to send bulletins to law enforcement warning them about Harpster's work. There's also now a study in the works looking at 1,000 911 calls, and they've asked Harpster for his data, a common thing in the academic world, but shocker, he has refused, claiming that other academics are going to steal his work. And in general, we just have a fucked situation, because if the authorities getting called or investigating or using this junk science, they're going to get a result that may not actually be true. And now, with more and more people learning about this junk science, they are going to be scared to call the authorities because, oh my god, is my call going to be weaponized against me? And until this bullshit methodology gets cracked down on, it is very likely we're going to hear more and more cases where people are getting put behind bars, at least partially because of 911 call analysis. But that is where I'm going to end talking about the stories that I wanted to get to this last week, but just didn't have the time to. And actually, on that note, before we jump into next week with a brand new Monday Philip DeFranco show tomorrow, I think it's important we take a look back at the other news we did cover. And we're going to do that with some help from our buddy, Zed Tabani. Zed?
Hey. I used to always dream of being verified. Then I found out all I gotta do is pay a guy. I wondered what it's like in movies by the rogue AI before Bing sold me a children's book and plagiarized. I used to wonder if it's Trump again in 24 while grand jurors in a case go on a public tour. I hear when one dries up a lake they fill a reservoir. This week's shootings are Texas, Pine Hills, and Mardi Gras. The new normal is horrifying. Your treaties keep on retiring. Cold War in an era where they fucked up what's private. As bad as the climate. If someone dying, they'll find them with a TikTok badge. It's that bad, like Biden versus asylum. Like I feel so lost, triple the cost, when they say they gon' make things better. I'm trying hard to keep up my guard, thinking I can make this better. Who gets the web in a national divorce? I see some nervous debates in the courts. Are we the ones to make decisions on the internet soul? I wish you had that same energy when challenging Roe. Now couples gotta give birth just to watch their kids go. You never think of consequences till the train blowing smoke and the chemicals soaked in the water where the politics float. The companies like cloud chasers killing dogs on the road for the views that they sold. So Willa's joking about the Oscars. Subway wanna get some charges. Olive oil in my coffee, but they spell my name wrong. Trying to stay strong. Don't you take no fuck ups on my story like I'm rolled. Oh, hell no. Keep my flaws present like Spain getting trains measured. A blizzard in LA, all the water is drained Venice. They sticking with Don Lemon, those comments were still sexist. And Fox lied on elections to boost their viewer retention. What's up? Hard times come from a big life, like how good movies always tend to come from a big strike. YouTube CEO or not, fuck all my dislikes. I'ma buy all of my dips till the stock rise. Come on, like I feel so lost, triple my cost. They say they gon' make things better. I'm trying hard to keep up my guard, thinking we can make this better. Hey yo, shout out to all you beautiful bastards for supporting Freestyle the News over these last few weeks. It's been good, life is good, Marvel's and Evo, I'm hype as fuck, man, let's go. Check it, hey. If you see this in 10 years, make it a bestseller. If they asking if Joel dies, maybe don't tell him. If you go to Arby's to subscribe, bro, I don't get it. Like if you hiring a child to clean a meat processor. What the fuck is this, the jungle? Upton rolling in his grave, going backwards like the Saudis trying to take this scent away. I saw this fucker say, listen, child abuse is never great, but if we're thinking about the state, how much money does it save? Bitch, you the literal devil's advocate. Working in the news, I feel like a fucking masochist. Shootings every week, headlines are always plastered with Elon, Kanye, or AI did something massively fucked up. I'm bust up like missiles from Russia. China hanging with them, who trusts what? Making up a tour out of a jury indictment. Fucking up the case like drunk white girls bullying your storefront. Hold up. Okay, Wisconsin, another state election where ignorance gonna cost us. The state Supreme Court got a bunch of shit on the docket like abortion and gerrymanders, litany of these problems in one race. Kelly pro to say with all the shit is looking dangerous. Gerrymandered legislatures either stay or get remade. And plus this law from 1849 that came in after Roe v. Wade was overturned could make it so that ban will remain. Yo, this isn't a game. Can't get a milli just by hitting on the start of their frames. You gotta engage. I'm working every second they let me, and I ain't wishing on a falling star. Like Jeffrey. Ooh. Too soon. You'll find this and all the other Freestyle of the News on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you listen. We back at it next week.
%75% of people who get diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder are men. Okay? So like for every 3 men that gets diagnosed, you get 1 woman who gets diagnosed with NPD. The interesting thing though is that Karens tend to be a little bit more on the narcissistic side, right? So they'll be very, very prideful, very angry, very blaming of other people. So Karens tend to be entitled. And what does that mean? So that means that when they show up somewhere, they expect something to happen and they believe that they deserve something, right? So if I show up at a tire store and I'm like, I want a pizza, like, I deserve a pizza, and like it's not my mistake that I showed up at a tire store. It's your mistake for not providing me with pizza. They also tend to be shown as having a particular kind of haircut. We'll even dig into why that is, okay? So I don't know if you guys know this, but recently, especially during the pandemic, Karens have been on the rise. Right? So that we see more and more videos about Karens. And so generally speaking, what a Karen is someone who gets really upset at something and mistreats someone. Oftentimes the Karen is female, which we'll kind of get to in a second. Oftentimes the Karen is white, and even some people have defined Karen as being specifically a Caucasian or white person, so you can't have Karens of other race. We'll kind of dig into that a little bit. And then what happens is like these people are mistreating people, they're yelling, they're screaming, they're being generally mean. Another, really common sort of thing is like they want to speak to the manager. They're unwilling to like really understand that things are not the fault of the person that they're talking to, right? So like a classic Karen thing is like, I'm going to go to a pizza shop and order, or I'm going to go to a tire shop and order a pizza. And then like, the tire shop is like, we don't sell pizza, we're a tire shop. And then the Karen gets really, really, really angry at the person who's like behind the desk. And so there's even like, I think there's some, even some really interesting, memes about this, right? So like one is, and so Karens are kind of like, what they tend to do is when they get denied something that they want, what they tend to do is try to appeal to higher authority or think that their way is the right way and that other people are objectively wrong. And we've even seen like some really good memes about Karens, right? So another important thing to consider is that the Karen is actually like an internet phenomenon, right? And so like, this is the Elon Musk Karen. They also tend to be shown as having a particular kind of haircut. We'll even dig into why that is, okay? So I think there's truth to all these things. So this is where, let's kind of just start by kind of understanding like a little bit about, what's going on with Karens. So the first thing is like, let's talk about features of a Karen. So Karens tend to be self-absorbed, right? So they're not very empathic. They tend to mistreat people who are like in the service industry or they view as like socially below them. when they get denied something that may not be out of any malicious intent, they tend to get like angry and explode at people. They also will oftentimes appeal to higher authority. And so they'll do things like call the police. They'll also like yell particular words that are grossly inappropriate to the situation. Right. So if like, you know, I saw some video where there was a black person who had asked a white woman to put their dog on a leash because it was, you know, like that's the rules for the park that they were in. And then the woman started yelling rape and like the dude was super confused. And so they tend to like engage in very, very unhealthy or explosive or abusive behaviors. Generally speaking, they don't seem to be very happy. So kind of what's going on with a Karen? I also see the word narcissism tossed around a lot. So we're going to talk for a second about narcissism. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, what are the characteristics of Karens? What do we know about certain personality characteristics that people may have and certain personality aspects that may apply to Karens? We're going to talk a little bit about how Karens form and how our impressions of Karens form. We're also going to touch on some of these more social implications, like issues of race or gender. That's definitely not my area of expertise. So I'm going to just kind of like really call attention to the fact that this exists, but it's not really something that we're going to sort of dive into. And then, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about, and so then we'll kind of summarize, like, you know, why are Karens a thing? And even to a certain extent, why is their hair a particular way? So let's start by understanding narcissism. So a lot of people, when they see a Karen, they will say like, oh, this person is so self-absorbed, they're narcissistic. So we have to understand a couple of things about personality characteristics and personality disorders specifically. So if you look at statistics, 75% of people who get diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder are men. Okay? So like for every 3 men that gets diagnosed, you get 1 woman who gets diagnosed with NPD. And there are other personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder, that I think basically has the flip ratio. So the majority of people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are actually women. And so some people may wonder, is this like a gender bias? Is this a bias in the way that we diagnose things? Like what's going on here? So I want y'all to, we're going to sort of take a step back and look at the history of psychiatric diagnosis. And prior to our current system of diagnosis, we used to have something called, the personality disorders used to be clustered. So there used to be cluster A personality disorders, cluster B personality disorders, and cluster C personality disorders. And back in this classification, cluster B included narcissism, histrionic, which is like when you have grandiose kind of shows of things, and borderline personality disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. And so essentially what we kind of saw was that there was a gender split in the cluster B personality disorders, that narcissists and sociopaths tended to be more men, right? So like the majority of people who get diagnosed with these things are men. And the majority of people who get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder were women. But as like psychoanalysts and psychologists and like psychiatrists were looking at this kind of stuff, what they sort of realized is that there's a common root, which is why these got clustered together. And possibly due to the way that we get socialized and some other aspects of gender-specific things, that you can have a common root of like a lack of self-worth or an importance of other people treating you a particular way. That's kind of the core of all of these personality disorders. That depending on your upbringing in society and even maybe to some degree like the effects of the Y chromosome and stuff like that, that this common root will manifest in one of 2 dimensions or directions. And if you're a man, it basically manifests as narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. If you're a woman, it's more likely to manifest as histrionic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. So the common root, just to kind of explain this, is sort of this idea that like my self-worth is determined by how I am treated. So the way that I feel about myself depends on how other people treat me. So if I'm treated well, I feel good. If I'm treated poorly, I feel bad. And then each of these people, this is a little bit less true for antisocial personality disorder. I think that's in a lot of ways the odd one out. And then what a lot of people will do is engage in behaviors to correct this. So for example, when you have a histrionic person, this is someone who will like cry wildly, will engage in just very drastic, overt shows of behavior, usually for the purpose of getting some kind of emotional support or some kind of love, essentially. So we'll also see this in people who have borderline personality disorder, where if you try to break up with someone who has borderline personality disorder, or if you set some kind of limit on them, so you say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't talk right now, I'm busy, they will feel really, really bad. They'll feel very, very rejected. And as they feel rejected, they will engage in all manner of different kinds of behaviors to fix that. So if they want to talk to you, they want to talk to you, and they'll do whatever it takes to talk to you. And so over time, they need you to talk to them, right? So that they really, really want to engage in this conversation. And if you set some kind of limit, they'll do all kinds of behaviors. On the one hand, they'll cry. They'll sort of sometimes they'll do things like threaten suicide, right? So I don't want you to leave me. So if you try to leave, I'll threaten suicide. Maybe they may actually feel like killing themselves in that moment. But the key thing is that when they threaten suicide, that changes the behavior of the other party. And then if you say, oh, no, don't do that. Okay, fine, I'll stay. And so they'll sort of be very kind of emotionally manipulative that way. So people on the other end of the spectrum feel very emotionally manipulated, right, if you're in a relationship with this person. But I don't think it's quite as malicious as people experience it as. These are just ways of getting our needs met. And so on the narcissistic side, for example, we'll also see similar things, but it's they'll get angry if someone threatens their credibility. They'll get angry if someone threatens their competence. They'll lash out. Oftentimes they won't cry. They'll do kind of the opposite. They'll bully people, right? So one is kind of this emotionally manipulative, kind of being a vulnerable bully versus an overt bully. And so as people sort of were looking at narcissism, they also realized the same thing is going on. I need people to treat me with respect, and I'm going to do whatever I need to get the praise and affection of other people. So people who are narcissistic will brag, right? They'll show off. They'll show people how much money they have. They'll, make these really out of touch statements. I recently saw a video about a guy who was talking about how the ROI on cooking is really, really bad, so no one should ever cook if you want to make it big in life, right? So they'll have these very interesting conclusions. I mean, there may be some validity to that statement on some level, but generally speaking, narcissists will be big on show. And if we show, if I show that I'm awesome and people are oh my God, you're so awesome, that'll kind of feed my narcissism, and then I feel good about myself because everyone is treating me well. So it's once again a behavioral reinforcement, because if I show off and people respond to me positively, then that's going to reinforce my desire to show off more. Okay? So the key thing here is that the Karen is not really on the borderline, or sometimes they can be on the histrionic side, right? So yelling randomly, when someone is, telling you to put your dog on a leash is a good example of histrionics. The interesting thing, though, is that Karens tend to be a little bit more on the narcissistic side, right? So they'll be very, very prideful, very angry, very blaming of other people. And that's generally speaking is more common in men than women, which probably has something to do with the way that the diagnosis was developed. So the early interviews and the early diagnostic criteria of narcissistic personality disorder was heavily influenced by men. So people were, I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that when people were looking at narcissism and trying to define the characteristics, they were interviewing primarily men. And so as they interviewed primarily men, they didn't really appreciate that there's a gender component to this. And so they selected for these things like grandiosity, which is a big part of the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, which is less common in women, in female narcissists, but more common in male narcissists. Grandiosity is a big part of it. So part of this diagnosis is kind of it's sort of shaped in the way it has sort of an inherent gender built into it. And Karens are kind of narcissistic, okay? So the other aspects of Karens that are kind of interesting is that they tend to have a sense of entitlement. Now, this is where a lot of people start to bring in race, socioeconomic status, and things like that, and for good reason. So Karens tend to be entitled. And what does that mean? So that means that when they show up somewhere, they expect something to happen, and they believe that they deserve something, right? So if I show up at a tire store and I'm I want a pizza, I deserve a pizza, and like that's not it's not my mistake that I showed up at a tire store. It's your mistake for not providing me with pizza. And part of what we see here is sort of like this narcissistic defense mechanism where like the stupider you make a Karen feel, the more you kind of threaten them, the more of an explosion you're going to get from the Karen. So if a Karen goes to a tire store and they ask for pizza, that is objectively idiotic. The more of the objectively idiotic situation you put a Karen into, the more idiotic they are, the more of a Karen response you're going to get, right? So this is why, like, if you tell someone, hey, your dog needs to be on a leash, and, like, clearly the Karen is in the wrong, and this is what we see in Karen videos, right, is, like, the Karen is clearly in the wrong. That's why it's really, really easy to hate Karens, because they're clearly in the wrong. It's really easy to make fun of them, because they're clearly in the wrong. And because of the way that the kind of psychology of narcissistic defense mechanisms work, the more idiotic we make you feel, the more Karen behavior is going to come out, right? Because an apology is like out of the question. I'm like in it, so it's kind of bizarre. So this is what creates such an extreme scenario. So the size of the explosion is going to be correlated with the size of the idiocy. And furthermore, on the internet, we have something that selects for extremes, right? We don't select for like mild things. So what tends to happen on social media is what floats to the surface are the most extreme examples, which in turn gives this idea that Karens are like absolutely insane, right? Because we're sort of catching them at their lowest moments. Sure, they're responsible for sure. But Karens, I don't think are like, some of it is like personality, but some of it is like catching them on a bad day, right? So anyone we can kind of catch on a bad day and they're going to behave more extremely. The problem is that with the internet, what we tend to propagate is the most extremes. So if you look at like, an internet video of a particular person, chances are what you're going to find for any given random person, if you have a little bit of internet fame, chances are what you have internet fame for is one of the most extreme moments in your life, right? So if it's like, woman survives shark attack, and it's like a video of a woman, like everyone sees that video and it's like that woman's life is not shark attack after shark attack after shark attack. But the way that the internet works, we tend to propagate the most extreme situations. So Karens are sort of placed in this situation where they're like, they feel like idiots, probably because they make some kind of mistake and someone's setting some kind of limit on them. Hopefully, I like to think compassionately for a second and think you catch them on a bad day, they have some kind of explosion. So let's talk a little bit about the explosion and what's going on there. So we're going to talk a little bit about entitlement, okay? So the other thing that Karens tend to do is they tend to have a lot of privilege, right? So they like feel entitled. So this study was looking at the psychology of what's called entrenched privilege, which is high socioeconomic status individuals from affluent backgrounds are uniquely high in entitlement. So this is also where there's this kind of this idea that a Karen is like a rich white woman, which I don't think is necessarily true because I've seen a lot of Karen behavior, like from people who are from lower socioeconomic statuses. And so the interesting thing that this paper sort of found is that the amount of entitlement that you have is not necessarily based on your socioeconomic status, which is interesting. It's based on the socioeconomic status that you grew up in. So what we tend to find is that people who are born into low socioeconomic status and become wealthy are not entitled. People who are born into low socioeconomic status and stay in low socioeconomic status are not entitled. But when you come from high socioeconomic status, that's what makes you entitled. So when you grow up with privilege, that's what gives you this idea, and it sort of makes sense, right? So if you grow up in a situation where your parents are able to provide for you Christmas presents without worrying about financial things, you will come to expect and even be entitled to Christmas gifts, right? The same is true of birthdays. If you come from a background where like birthday gifts, like you get a ton of gifts on your birthday, you will come to be entitled to and expect birthday gifts. So what we tend to find is that generally speaking, entitlement has to do with your background, which also we can sort of see kind of a racial component here, which is that generally speaking, if we look at, all of the ethnicities Caucasians, I don't know if this statement is factually true. I think it is, but feel free to correct me. So generally speaking, I think the highest percentage of people, at least in the West, that come from high socioeconomic backgrounds are going to be Caucasian, right? So we can sort of start to see a little bit of a racial component here. The other interesting thing that's very fascinating is if we look at people who have high levels of entitlement, they are much more likely to respond to bad luck with anger, okay? So this really explains a lot about a Karen. So we have a Karen who probably grew up expecting a lot, right? Maybe was a someone. And this is where the narcissism also comes in, which is like, when I come from a prominent family and I used to be rich and I used to be a big deal, or I grew up in a southern town where my mom was this and my dad was this and my dad was like president of the Rotary Club, and then I kind of don't amount to much and I wind up in Walmart. Nothing against people who shop at Walmart. I shop at Walmart too on occasion. Like this kind of faded glory enhances this narcissism and it gives these people a sense of entitlement. And then what tends to happen is like sometimes it's not even your fault that you went to the tire store, right? Because the tire store is called Pizza Pie, right? Pizza Pie Tires. And it's like, or something like that. I don't know. And so then what happens is these Karens sometimes will genuinely face like bad luck. It's not their fault. Like if I go to a store and something is out of stock, right? It's not like my fault that they're out of stock. It's not the service person's like fault. Mario tires, perfect. It's not the service it's not like the checkout person's fault that something is out of stock. But my sense of entitlement when there are events that are not really against me in any way and I experience bad luck, I tend to have some kind of explosion. And so this is another thing that sort of contributes to the Karens, is that generally speaking, something is wrong that starts the Karen off, right? It's not like the Karen just walks in, and maybe I could be wrong here, but generally speaking, there's something that like gets this going. Either the Karen makes a mistake, the Karen gets criticized in some way, the Karen feels afraid or something like that, they feel threatened, or there's like some kind of bad luck. What do you mean you're out of like my favorite coffee beverage? How dare you? And they'll sort of take it as a personal insult. There's something negative that happens, and then they tend to lash out at the person who's nearest to them. This is another area where I think the entitlement and sort of the hatred towards Karens really comes from. Is what we usually see is that Karens are people who believe in like kind of a clear hierarchy. And so what they sort of, probably this has to do with developmental upbringing and stuff like that. They think that some people are above them and some people are below them. And so what we tend to see a lot of Karens doing is abusing people in the service industry, right? So there's like a waiter or a clerk or something like that who really has no control over what the Karen wants. But the Karen just feels completely entitled to kind of like lash out at them. And this is where the let me speak to your manager kind of things comes from. So if we kind of tunnel down a little bit more, we can hypothesize a couple of other things. So let's talk about let me speak to your manager. So human beings tend to attribute the behavior to other people engage in to their own psychology. So if someone does something, this is normal. So if someone does something, the intention behind that behavior is not based on my observation of that person, but is based on my own beliefs. So if someone waves to me, the meaning of that is going to be based on why would I wave to someone, okay? So we see a lot of these kinds of problems in like relationships and stuff when, for example, different things mean different things to different people. So for example, I've had relationships where people will get upset with me because I don't like call or text them on a regular basis. And for some people, calling or texting on a regular basis is a sign of caring about another person. So there's a behavior, and what that behavior means, the intention behind that behavior, the meaning of that behavior is different to different people. Whereas like, I'm okay. Like if you don't text me for a month or even 3 months or a year, I've had friends that I haven't seen in like 2 years. I haven't even talked to them in 2 years. And we'll see each other after 2 years, and it's like we pick up exactly where we left off. The time doesn't really mean much to me in terms of like the maintenance or importance of a relationship. The point is that different behaviors will mean different things to different people. And oftentimes what we'll see in Karens is that Karens will be like big into petty power plays and gatekeeping people and like other kinds of like petty kind of toxic behavior, which means that when they feel gate kept by someone, they're attributing their own intentions to that person, right? So like if I'm a Karen and I tend to be petty, like if it's like someone asks me for help but like doesn't do it in, you know, a nice enough way and I feel offended, like I'm not going to help them. You know, I'm going to be like a petty overlord over my domain, and I'm going to gatekeep whenever I can. And so then what happens is when someone else sets a limit on them, they are attributing all of their own internal intentions to that person's behavior. And that oftentimes really upsets them. The other thing is that Karens also oftentimes, I mean, we've never interviewed a Karen, right? So we don't really know here, but this is all kind of hypothesis based on some scientific studies and observations of behavior. So the other thing is that Karens tend to think that they're objectively right, right? So like if they're entitled, they're like, this is the way of the world. Like I deserve a pizza, whether it's a tire shop or whatever. For some reason, they've grown up in a particular way where the world needs to conform to my wants. This is a key concept that they've kind of grown up with. And chances are they grew up in a household where like this was happening, right? So there was a domineering figure in the household, and when they were a kid, what they wanted didn't matter. And there's a powerful person in the household, there's a powerful person in the hierarchy, and what they want, their word is law. And so as the Karen assumes that role, as they grow into the parent, they start behaving the same way because that's the rules of the world that they were taught. And so they sometimes feel like this petty person is gatekeeping me. I'm better than this person. I don't need to listen to this person. This person must be incompetent because they're not providing me with what I want. I feel entitled. I get angry. So let me talk to your manager, because surely someone with more power and more competence than you is more likely to agree with me, right? That's the idea behind the Karen, is because like I'm objectively right. So the more powerful you get and the smarter you get, the more likely they are to fix this problem on my behalf. Now, the other challenging thing here is that sometimes that behavior gets reinforced, right? So like this is the kind of thing where like talking to a manager can be sort of assuaging for your ego to begin with.
Be their supply.
And a manager comes out and apologizes or maybe fixes the problem or does some kind of override that the lower person couldn't do. But sometimes this behavior gets reinforced, right? By talking to the manager and making enough of a hissy fit, I actually get what I want. So throwing temper tantrums, why do people throw temper tantrums? Because they get us what we want, right? This kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about narcissism and borderline and histrionic, that if a behavior gets rewarded, even if it's a nasty behavior, that behavior is going to get reinforced. So why do they ask for managers? Because sometimes asking for managers works, right? So we've conditioned Karens. So that's sort of the psychology of a Karen. Now we're going to look at a couple of other dimensions. So one is that there seems to be a racial component to Karen. So some people even define Karens as, first of all, women, and second of all, white. And so we're going to kind of take a quick look at this paper. And so the angry Karen is invoked to indicate her manipulation of her racial power, but she is equally significant, we suggest, for her positioning within a pre-existing antagonistic service economy. So this is a paper that's sort of talking a little bit about racial components to Karenism, which I think is like very possible or a component of it. So as the term has grown, I think it started to encompass men and people of different ethnicities. It's not my place to say, you know, that this is right or wrong. I think if we look back at sort of tracing the etiology or the origin of the word Karen, I think it actually started on Twitter in predominantly black communities talking about white people and their experience of working with entitled white women. So, you know, I'm not saying that Karen's going to be exclusively white. It's not my place to make that judgment. I think that there's sort of like, there are definitely racial components to this. But it's unclear to me. I don't think there's real, you know, science that's been done on this. People have made observations and terms tend to evolve and stuff like that. And clearly, like, you know, Elon Musk being a Karen sort of suggests that, I mean, he's white, but he's not a woman. And so I've seen also on social media videos of non-white women being Karens as well. But like there's definitely seems to be sort of a shared experience or common experience that Karens are oftentimes white. And that may in turn have to do with things like socioeconomic status or entitlement, which may be more correlated with Caucasian ethnicity as opposed to other ethnicities, so it sort of makes sense to me. But I don't think it's necessarily white. I think it's these other constituent components that are correlated with race. The next thing is that there are even tones now of like different kinds of, once again, racial, this doesn't sort of talk about it, but there are like racial components, but there are also starting to be gender components of Karens. So sometimes like misogynistic people will use, or people with misogynistic attitudes will like use the term of Karen, right? So like it's also become a vehicle that has been co-opted for misogyny. The interesting thing is that there are terms that have been co-opted for misandry as well, right? So like I think incel and simp are two words that, for example, like have been co-opted, right? So these are things that now if people have misandric views, they'll sort of use these kinds of terms as like a way to blame the person for being this thing, which is actually like a mask for my anti-gender language. Okay? So we're just gonna kind of touch on that. There are definitely like racial and gender components to Karen, not my area of expertise. So next thing that we're gonna talk a little bit about is why are Karens on the rise and what's going on. So next thing to talk a little bit about is online presence. So I think part of the reason that we've seen so many more Karens recently is that a couple of things. So the first is that we've seen a rise of Karens during the pandemic, okay? And so I think this has a lot of really, really interesting connotations to it. The first is that the pandemic was an inordinate amount of stress on people as a whole. So when you stress the whole population, right, the people who have these Karen tendencies are going to respond to the stress in a particularly negative way, okay? So the first thing is that the world was worse for everyone, and everyone is getting worse. So we saw, increases like up to, even by some statistics, 300% increases in things like depression and anxiety. So we're going to see like different people respond to stress in different ways. So some people get depressed, some people get anxious. We also saw, an increase in suicidal ideation. Unclear whether there was really an increase in total net suicides. I haven't seen the data on that. But we're also seeing an increase in like Karen-like behavior, right? Being angry, entitled. The other thing to remember is that the pandemic also had other influences besides stress on Karen explosions. Because remember that the pandemic resulted in more people having bad luck, right? So the likelihood that stores were closed, the likelihood that they didn't have your product in stock, people are out sick, so things are taking longer at restaurants, right? People are understaffed, they can't work. All kinds of changes happened that made the world objectively like a harder place to live in. And if we remember about people with entitlement who experience bad luck respond with anger, the pandemic is going to increase that kind of relationship, okay? So the pandemic is sort of like, it's stressful mentally, but also objectively and physically and in the world, Karens have more things to be upset about, right? So when these two things come together, they're going to increase Karen-like behavior, which is part of the reason why I think we saw such an explosion of Karen stuff on social media. Which brings me to the last point that we're going to talk about Karens, which is online drift. So the other thing that's kind of going on the internet, so there's even some studies that sort of show that participation in particular kinds of social media activities are more likely to engage in like entitlement behavior. So like mask mandates and sheeple and things like that is a good example of this, where if people are talking about, like for example, there were particular groups, social media groups that cause people to become radicalized. And oftentimes Karens are a part of those groups, right? So now, for example, like when a Karen walks into a restaurant that has a mask mandate, as a result of the radicalization of online drift, that Karen is much more likely to explode. So what does that mean? The radicalization of online drift. So generally speaking, there is a surface of the internet. And the surface of the internet is generally speaking like pretty acceptable. And then what we see on the internet, and there have been really good studies done about this, that what happens over time is like I start out up here, but over time I'll like drift deeper into the internet and into more radical extremes, okay? So like a good example of this is like, you can start out on Google or Wikipedia, which is like relatively neutral. But as you move from platforms, or even things like Twitter, where as you move from platforms like Twitter to Reddit to Discord to specific Discords to, like 4chan, 8chan, like, 8chan is just twice as much as 4chan, right? So like what happens is like we'll move to more radical platforms that are more like echo chambers and will actually like radicalize our thinking. So this is something that it doesn't also have to be in that sort of way. So the other way, the interesting thing, we should maybe do an experiment on this. Or if you go on YouTube, you'll also go down like radicalization algorithms, right? So if you watch a single video on a particular topic,
down the rabbit hole,
YouTube will start pushing you in that direction. So if you watch a single topic about, let's say like an inflammatory video about feminism or misandry, like you'll start going down a particular way. If you watch something that is misogynistic, you'll start getting fed like other misogynistic videos. If you start watching like, so I would sometimes watch cooking videos. And so like now like half of my YouTube suggestions are like people grilling things, okay? And like it starts out with like a very simple grilling thing, but then like over time we're getting into like hardcore grilling in my YouTube algorithm. My YouTube algorithm is super confused though, because my wife watches stuff on it, my kids watch stuff on it. So the YouTube doesn't know what to serve us. It doesn't know if we want a video about grilling steak, like nursery rhymes, or like Dota VODs, or makeup tutorials. Like my YouTube algorithm is so confused, right? But what happens with Karens is that they tend to engage in social communities, online social communities, where there's a heavy amount of drift and radicalization, which then like changes the way they view the world. And then when they go interact in public, right? So if I am participating in like racially discriminatory groups, so like where hate speech, anti-black people, and I'm walking in the park without a dog, with my dog off the leash, and a black man walks up to me and asks me to put the dog on the leash, all of that radicalization is going to come to a head, combined with the narcissistic injury of me breaking a rule. And since I'm racist, a black person telling me about rules, like how dare they, right? And so then I'm going to explode, and then it gets captured on social media. Then it gets posted somewhere. Everyone sees it. And then what do you think happens to a Karen who sees themselves on social media? Because now we're going to come full circle, right? So what happens? The narcissistic injury gets way worse, right? They feel more hurt. And the more hurt they feel, the more of an idiot they seem, they radicalize even further, right? They become even more narcissistic. And then they're like, how dare they? Now it's like these young kids on the internet, right? And now they're poo-pooing millennials and Gen Z because the millennials made me look like an idiot. And so it kind of like, it just loops. And so like this phenomenology of Karens is really fascinating. I don't know how much of what I'm saying is actually like scientifically valid, right? So it's like, this is the kind of thing where we have to extrapolate. There aren't studies. I mean, there are studies. We looked at a couple. But the truth is that it's a complex phenomenon that involves all kinds of things. It probably starts with some amount of personality characteristics. Probably starts with a particular kind of upbringing that leads to a sense of entitlement, which may have something to do with socioeconomic status, may have something to do with race. And then as we start to add some of these issues about stress from the pandemic, the way that stress manifests, even bad luck, and then when we toss on a couple of other, lighter fuel on the flame, the first bit of lighter fuel is the internet, where the most extreme content becomes normalized. And then we get an impression that this is what Karens are behaving like day in and day out, right? Whereas hopefully, thankfully, I think, people are not, this isn't happening every day to people. I mean, we encounter it from time to time. Everyone encounters it from time to time. But the internet is all about making the extreme and rare very, very common, right? That's what we get propagated on. This is really simple. Like even for, dozens now, so like for 20 years, if you look at things like Facebook. So Facebook, early on when we were looking at the early impacts of mental health on Facebook, or even things like Twitch, this applies to basically all the platforms, where like I log on, it's my birthday one day out of 365 days a year. But every day I log on and I see like people celebrating their birthdays, it makes me feel like people are just having the time of their life all the time. Because the things that are most upvoted, the things that are liked the most are the things that are going to show up on my feed. And so one thing from each person on my, how many people I'm friends with, is going to show up on my feed once a year, one birthday. But what it looks to me is I'm only celebrating my birthday one day out of 365, and all these people are constantly celebrating birthdays and constantly having a good time. So the extremes rise to the top and give us an unfair perspective on what the world is actually like. So this is why like spending time on the internet skews our view. That combined with things like online drift and online radicalization, when Karens participate in these online communities where, you know, the people are being racially attacked constantly. And let's remember that these online communities don't really think critically, right? And the ones that we're a part of, you may think, ah, ha, 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 the Karens, they're not thinking critically, but I guarantee you the community you're in right now doesn't think critically either. That's just not how they work. So if I go onto the Dota 2 subreddit and make a post about LOL, I played both of these games for 5 years. I objectively think that LOL is better. Here's why. I'm going to get downvoted into oblivion. No one's going to take that seriously. I can go onto the LOL subreddit and do the same thing. I played both of these games, and you can make the same exact post. And if you post it in the Dota 2 subreddit, Dota 2 is better than LOL, you're going to get 1,000 upvotes. If you post it in the LOL subreddit, you're going to get 10,000 downvotes because the LOL community is so much bigger. Right? So this is where, like, this is going to happen in online communities, and we're not actually that different. So this online drift sort of reinforces the ideas that a Karen has. And then once again, once we make fun of the Karens, right, because we don't treat them with compassion. So if I had to ask y'all, you know, my sense is that the person who is the least deserving, the class of people who is the least deserving of compassion are Karens, right, on the internet. And so this is just a consequence of the world that we live in. So that's what I'm thinking about Karens. Hopefully that'll help you understand. Last thing, I'll kind of give you hopefully some tips about how to deal with a Karen in the wild, but unclear whether these will actually work. So the first thing is to remember that a Karen is not a person, it's a state. I believe this. It's a state of mind. So this goes back to something that I remember learning in medical school, where there aren't good doctors and bad doctors. That's actually not true. There are, but generally speaking, there are good doctor days and bad doctor days, right? All doctors have good days, all doctors have bad days. And if you're a patient who encounters a doctor on a bad day, you're going to conclude that this is a bad doctor. The truth is there are good doctor days and there are bad doctor days. Now, there are bad doctors. There are some doctors who have such a high amount of bad doctor days and make, you know, bad medical decisions on a consistent basis that they're bad doctors. But generally speaking, I think that's true. So remember to try to have a little bit of compassion for the Karen. Right? So I think this is the kind of thing where like making them feel stupid may make you feel good, but it's probably not going to help the situation. That being said, it is important to set good boundaries with a Karen, right? So this is where like I personally like it when managers have their employees back and don't reinforce the behavior of the Karen, do something good for the world and don't appease them, and at the same time treat them with a compassion, right? So this is one of the most challenging things that you can do. So one of the hardest skills to learn is how to be compassionate while maintaining your boundaries. So the two tend to like feel different, right? So for people who, when we be nice, we tend to like compromise our boundaries. Oh yeah, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You don't have to get me something for, you know, my birthday, even though I've gotten you things for your birthday for the last 3 years. It's okay. Or what we do is we get mad at people and then we lack compassion. So, you know, try to recognize that they're having a bad day, enforce your boundary, hold it, and they may explode, and then, you know, there's nothing else you can do about that, which is why I think that this sort of, you know, got to take this with a grain of salt. Because I think for some of the videos that I've seen of, like, Karens exploding, like, I don't think that that's, you know, strong behavioral reinforcement, like kicking them out, calling the police, those are going to be your only options. But I do think that the world, you know, maybe you can prevent things from getting to that point by trying to be just a little bit more compassionate. Questions? Is there a guidebook to Karens? No, I think this video is like the first attempt at something like that, right? Do Karens smell fear? Absolutely. So I know it sounds like a funny question, but I think so. So I think a lot of people, if you look at cluster B personality disordered people, they're very, very good at detecting particular things in other human beings. So this is kind of a weird study that I've cited before. So they took a group of people with borderline personality disorder. And what they sort of, when you say can they smell fear, you have no idea how right you are. So they took people with borderline personality disorder, and they filmed a regular face that was smiling going to a frown. So smiling, I hate you, right? So if you take that video of me smiling to being angry, and you split it up into 100 still photographs, and somewhere in the middle is going to be a half smile and half frown, right? So if you take a normal person, as in a person who doesn't have a personality disorder, their brain cannot detect the anger until you're after the halfway point. So when we're at 51 to 60% angry from smiling, when we're less than half smiling and more than half angry, then a normal brain detects anger. For someone who has BPD, they detect anger at 20 to 30%, right? So this is actually like, it's not, when we say normal brain, I'm not saying their brain is like abnormal or ill or anything. Their brain has grown up to be more sensitive. It's actually, its detection capability is superior to a normal brain. So they can actually detect a negative emotion faster, which can be really, really challenging and also sort of makes sense, right? So if I'm a narcissist and someone is going to disrespect me, I can't wait until they're at 51% disrespect to act, right? The second I detect 20 or 30%, this is why we say narcissists are sensitive. So if you have a compliment, but you don't emotionally, like, that praise is not authentic or genuine, like, the narcissist will detect it. And they'll say, like, what's wrong, right? And if y'all have been in a relationship with someone who's got cluster B something, and they're like, tell me what's wrong. And you're like, nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. Because you're at 51% happy, 60% happy, 70% happy. But they're still able to detect that 20 to 30% unhappiness. Then they keep asking you, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And then they push you and push you and push you. You feel more frustrated. And then finally it comes out. And then the person is like, haha, I knew it all along. I knew that nastiness was in there. I knew you were upset with me. I knew you were mad at me. And so then the behavior gets reinforced. The bias gets confirmed. And then they do it again. So can Karen smell fear? I think so. I really think so. I think they can detect when a particular behavior will work, right? So if they smell fear, they're going to escalate their bullying because they know it'll work. And they may be able to detect it 30%, 40% fear, even when you're 70% confident. You're waffling a little bit. They'll smell it and they'll go for it. Okay, my question is, when talking about empathy in a person, be empathic, do they need to be born with it, or is it a skill that most people can learn? Both. So your upbringing will sort of naturally get you to a certain level of empathy. But the cool thing that we've learned is that EQ, or emotional quotient, which is like IQ, can actually be developed. So it's our hypothesis that improvements in our coaching program, the single thing that the coaching program, the single variable that is the most universal about how our coaching program helps people, is by boosting EQ. So I constantly ask my girlfriend what's wrong because I feel like she's actually upset. Does that suggest that I might be a narcissist? So remember that the labels are constellations of things, but the thing does not necessarily mean that you have the label. Okay? So for example, in depression, we can see weight gain. But everyone who gains weight does not have depression. Does that make sense? There are all kinds of reasons why you might have depression. There are all kinds of reasons why, if your girlfriend, you constantly ask your girlfriend what's wrong because I feel like she's actually upset. Does that suggest I might be a narcissist? Not really, because there are lots of reasons why you would constantly ask your girlfriend why she's upset. So I would not come away with this with a label. So the diagnosis of a personality disorder certainly can't be done by listening to a dude talking on stream. And even in a clinical setting, generally speaking, requires 6 months of observation. So the gold standard for diagnosing a personality disorder requires 6 months of psychiatric observation or treatment. Okay? And why is that? It's because remember that narcissism is a defense mechanism. So everyone has it. So why do you need 6 months? You need to track someone over time because you could be catching them at a bad point. When they're under a lot of stress, they may seem narcissistic, they may seem borderline, but that's an effect of the stress. And once the stress goes away, they're kind of back to normal. People who have true personality disorders, which remember is like somewhere around 4.8%, 4 to 7% of the population. So exceedingly small, right? So chances are there's like a 5% chance that you have this. So it's low. 95% chance that you don't have it. And so we can sort of respond with these defense mechanisms, but the personality disorder is diagnosed when this is kind of your default state. Can people with ASPD develop or learn empathy? Sort of. So it depends on the person. So in my experience, I've seen 2 classifications of ASPD, which is antisocial personality disorder. One is where there's like really something going on in their brain that makes it very, very hard, or I would even say like damn near impossible to learn empathy. But there are a lot of people who get diagnosed with stuff who are not like that. So this is the other thing to remember about psychiatric diagnoses is they're not like, they're patterns that we've recognized. So it's not like some of these binary questions will be yes or no. It's not like a stroke, where a stroke is like a discrete physical thing that we can track to a particular part of the brain and be very predictive about what it's going to do to you. Whereas for things like ASPD, these are like, psychiatrists have made observations. We don't have biopsies. We don't have x-rays. So I'm not saying they're not real things, but they're not as deterministic as other diseases. If you know you've become a sociopath, is there a way to rewire your brain to feel emotions like you should? Yeah, so let's talk about this. So if you know you have become a sociopath, the first question is, how do you know you've become a sociopath? See, I think y'all are hopefully making this mistake, because it's a good mistake to make. So if you've been evaluated for 6 months or a year by a clinician and they've diagnosed you with antisocial personality disorder and they say you are a sociopath, that's one thing. But a lot of times what happens, this is exactly why we say, like, we don't just use that medical disclaimer as like a, cover your ass thing. This is important to understand. Because a lot of people run around diagnosing themselves as sociopaths. Well, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, because I don't feel emotions. So this is exactly what happens, is what people do is they'll pick one symptom and then they'll arrive at a diagnosis. Oh, because I can't feel emotions, I'm a sociopath. But what you have to remember is that inability to feel emotions has a differential diagnosis. So maybe you're depressed. Maybe you're numb. Maybe you're using substances. Maybe you're alexithymic. So that's why I'm kind of saying, like, even for people who have come into my office with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, I found that there's actually 2 groups. One is like where there's some of this other stuff going on, like emotional numbness, which over time, like once we uncover that stuff, then they're able to like feel emotions and stuff like that. Whereas the other group like really has trouble with that. So I don't really know about that group. Right? So if you say, if you know you have become a sociopath, is there a way to rewire your brain? I'd say, like, unless you have a really, really good reason, which is I concluded is not a good reason. If you're using a label of sociopath, that needs to be assigned by someone who knows what it is and knows how to evaluate it from it properly. Not, this is what I think a sociopath is. I've watched 1,000 videos on YouTube, therefore I know. I'm not saying that your experience doesn't resonate with those things, but that's why differential diagnosis is so important. I'd say the biggest thing that people miss on the internet is the concept of differential diagnosis.
Alrighty. It's just about 2 o'clock here. Morning. So I am going to call it quits for now. I will next time. Thank you for keeping company and good night.